As Mike and Kiki sat by the stream, the gentle sound of flowing water filled the air. For a while they remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a sense of comfort in each other's presence. Finally, Kiki gathered her courage and broke the silence. "Mike," she began, her voice soft and hesitant, "I know what I did to you wasn't right. I deceived you and played you for a fool. I'm so sorry, Mike. It wasn't my intention." Mike turned his face towards her voice, his expression unreadable. Kiki continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was just too scared that you might leave me if you found out about the big scar on my face. It's happened to me more times than I can count. That's why I did what I did." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I know this isn't a good enough reason. I should have trusted you. But please, Mike, I'm sorry. I miss you so much, and I can't imagine my life without you. Please forgive me." Mike remained quiet for a long moment, his unseeing eyes fixed on the direction of the stream. Finally, he raised his head and spoke, his voice calm but tinged with hurt. "Why would you think I'd run away just because you have a scar? Am I not also disabled?" Kiki's voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, "No, you're not perfect. Nobody is." "Exactly," Mike continued. "So why did you think I would run away from you? Look at me, Kiki. I'm a blind man, yet I've never lied to you. I've opened up to you about everything, even things my parents don't know." Kiki remained silent, not knowing how to respond. After a moment, Mike added, "But that's not even what's bothering me the most right now." Curious, Kiki turned to face him fully. "Yes, I noticed you seemed sad about something else. What is it?" Mike's face clouded over as he began to explain. "Ever since your dad came to our community, my father has been jailed. He's facing a punishment he doesn't deserve." His voice cracked slightly as he finished speaking. "And I spoke to my mother in a rude way before leaving the house. I feel sad now, but she really hurt me." Sadness washed over Kiki's face. "This is all our fault," she said, her voice filled with regret. "My dad shouldn't have come to your community. It's my fault in the first place. He did it for me. Now look at what's happening." She paused before adding, "Even my dad was summoned by our king. He's also awaiting his punishment." Mike's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Really?" "Yes," Kiki confirmed. "I just wish all of this could end, and we could all go back to our normal lives." After a moment of reflection, Kiki spoke again, her voice filled with determination. "I'm so sorry about your dad. When I get home today, I promise to talk to my dad and see what we can do to help out." Mike turned towards her, sensing the genuine care and love in her voice. He nodded slowly. "I forgive you, Kiki. I want us to be happy together again, but this time, no more lies." A wide smile spread across Kiki's face, her eyes shining with happiness and relief. "I promise, Mike. No more lies. I promise to stand by you and cherish you for who you are." They both smiled, feeling the weight of their misunderstandings lifting. As they stood up to leave the stream, Kiki gently grabbed Mike's arm, stopping him. "Mike," she said softly, "please forgive your mother too. It's not easy for her, seeing her husband jailed for something as small as this. She must be hurting too." Mike's expression softened and he nodded. "You're right. I understand. I'll talk to her when I get home." As they walked away from the stream, hand in hand, both felt a renewed sense of hope. Despite the challenges their families were facing, they knew that together they could face whatever came their way. The air around them seemed lighter, filled with the promise of a brighter future and a stronger bond between them. In the Yoruba community, King Oba sat on his wooden throne, deep in discussion with his cabinet members. They had finally reached a decision on Mr. Akin's punishment. With a solemn nod, King Oba raised his hand, signaling for a guard to approach. The guard hurried forward, bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice low and deferential. "Go to Mr. Akin's house and summon him immediately," King Oba commanded, his voice firm. "At once, Your Majesty," the guard replied, bowing once more before turning and rushing out of the palace. As the guard left, one of the cabinet members turned to the king, his face etched with concern. "Your Highness," he said cautiously, "I hope this decision works. We cannot afford to go to war right now." King Oba nodded gravely. "Indeed, this punishment must serve as both a deterrent and a means of maintaining peace." Meanwhile, at Mr. Akin's compound, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Akin sat in his living room with Kiki, listening intently as she recounted her conversation with Mike and the troubles facing Mr. James. Papa, Kiki pleaded, her eyes brimming with tears, "Please, if there's anything you can do to help Mike's parents, it would mean so much. They're suffering because of us." Mr. Akin's face was a mask of sadness and regret. "I understand, Kiki," he said softly. "I never meant for this to happen. Our actions have brought shame and conflict to our communities, disrupting a peace that has lasted for generations." He paused, running a hand over his weary face. "I will do my best to make this right, to ease their suffering if I can." As they sat in contemplative silence, suddenly voices rang out from outside their hut. "Hello, who's in there?" a loud voice called. Mama Kiki emerged from the kitchen, her face etched with worry. "Honey, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Akin stood up, moving to the window to peek through the curtains. "It's the royal guards," he said, his voice tight with tension. Turning to his wife and daughter, he ordered, "Go to your rooms, both of you. I can't risk them taking you to the palace again." Without argument, Mama Kiki ushered Kiki into the bedroom, closing the door behind them. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Akin stepped outside to face the guards. "It's you again," he said, addressing the lead guard with forced calm. "What do I owe this visit?" The lead guard's face was impassive as he replied, "You have been summoned by the king. We must go immediately." Mr. Akin nodded, his heart heavy. Of course, I will go with you." As they began the journey to the palace, Mr. Akin's mind raced. He knew that his punishment had been decided, and now he was on his way to learn his fate. "Hopefully it won't be too severe," he muttered to himself, trying to quell the rising fear in his chest. The lead guard, overhearing Mr. Akin's whisper, spoke up. "Mr. Akin, I know this must be difficult for you," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But remember, the king is fair. He will consider all aspects of the situation." Mr. Akin nodded gratefully at the guard's unexpected kindness. "Thank you," he replied. "I just hope I can find a way to make things right, not just for myself, but for everyone involved." As they approached the palace, Mr. Akin squared his shoulders, preparing himself for whatever lay ahead. He thought of Kiki, of Mike and his family, of the peace between their communities that now hung in the balance. With each step, his resolve strengthened. Whatever his punishment might be, he would face it with dignity and do everything in his power to restore harmony to their lives. As Mr. Akin stepped into the palace, he was immediately struck by the grandeur of the surroundings. King Oba and his cabinet members sat before him, their faces solemn and expectant. "Welcome, Mr. Akin," King Oba said, his voice carrying across the room. With a wave of his hand, he dismissed the guards. Once they had left, the king leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Mr. Akin. "I hope the guards weren't too harsh with you." Mr. Akin managed a small smile. "No, my lord. I'm fine, thank you." King Oba nodded, satisfied. "Very good. Now, Mr. Akin, I'm sure you know why you're here." "Yes, my lord," Mr. Akin replied, his heart pounding in his chest. The king's expression grew serious. We have concluded our deliberations on your punishment. My cabinet members and I have decided that it is not in our best interest to go to war with the IGBO community, not because we fear them, but because we wish to avoid unnecessary loss of life over what is, essentially, a misunderstanding. Mr. Akin nodded in agreement. I support that decision wholeheartedly, my lord. Good King Oba continued. With this in mind, we have decided on your punishment. You will be required to provide a year's worth of food for the Agbibo community. Specifically, you must deliver 14 baskets of corn, 14 baskets of freshly harvested vegetables and tomatoes, and 25 tubers of yam every month for the next year. Mr. Akin's eyes widened slightly at the magnitude of the task, but he remained silent as the king continued. We know your farmland is extensive and can handle this demand. I urge you to carry out this responsibility without complaint. Is that clear? Yes, my lord, Mr. Akin replied. It is a fair price to pay for my actions. King Oba seemed pleased with this response. Very well. Do you have anything else to say? Mr. Akin took a deep breath before speaking. Yes, my lord. It has come to my attention that Mr. James, the man I went to see in the Agbibo community, is being held in a dungeon. His family is suffering greatly. I humbly request that you pass on a message to their king, asking him to release Mr. James, especially considering the substantial food contribution I will be making to their community. The king considered this for a moment before nodding. I will see what I can do, Mr. Akin. With a bow, Mr. Akin turned to leave. As he reached the door, King Oba called out, Mr. Akin, remember that your punishment is to be carried out immediately. I understand, my lord, Mr. Akin replied, bowing once more before exiting the palace. The journey home seemed shorter than usual, Mr. Akin's mind racing with plans and calculations. As he entered his hut, he found Mama Kiki and Kiki waiting anxiously in the living room. What happened? Papa Kiki asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Akin sank into a chair, exhaling deeply before recounting the details of his meeting with King Oba. As he explained the terms of his punishment, both Mama Kiki and Kiki listened intently, their expressions a mix of relief and concern. When he finished, Mama Kiki spoke up. It's a hefty punishment, my dear, but it could have been much worse. We should be grateful. Kiki nodded in agreement. And I even talked about Mr. James. The king assured me he will do his best. Oh, Papa, thank you. I hope it helps. Mr. Akin managed a small smile. I hope so too, my dear. Now, we must prepare. There's much work to be done. Without hesitation, Mr. Akin rose and began making preparations for the enormous task ahead. He headed out to his farmland, assessing the crops and planning the harvests that would fulfill his obligation to the Agbibo community. As the sun began to set over the Agbibo community, Mike made his way home, his heart heavy with the weight of recent events. As he stepped into the living room, he was met with a heart-wrenching sight. Mama Ada sat hunched over, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with quiet sobs. Mike's throat tightened with emotion. He moved quietly across the room and settled onto a wooden stool, his unseeing eyes downcast. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Mama Ada's muffled crying. Finally, Mike broke the silence, his voice soft and filled with regret. Mama, I'm sorry, he began. I'm sorry for raising my voice at you earlier and for walking out. I know you were angry, and that's why you did what you did. Mama Ada's sobs quieted as she listened to her son's words. Mike continued, his voice growing stronger. I won't say I understand perfectly, but I'm also going through what you're experiencing. We both miss Papa, and we're both scared and frustrated. He paused, taking a deep breath before adding, we need to calm down and not let our anger make us do things we'll regret later. We need to be strong for each other and for Papa." Mama Ada lifted her head, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Oh, Mike," she said, her voice quavering. "I'm sorry too, my son. It won't happen again, I promise. I just miss your father so much and feeling helpless. It's eating me up inside." Mike nodded, understanding all too well. "I know, Mama. I miss him too." Mama Ada reached out, finding Mike's hand and squeezing it gently. "We're here," unable to do anything, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It feels like we're trapped in a nightmare we can't wake up from." Mike squeezed his mother's hand back, offering what comfort he could. "Don't worry, Mama," he said, his voice filled with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "Everything will be fine. We have to believe that." As they sat together in the dimming light of the evening, a fragile sense of hope began to grow between them. They were still facing an uncertain future, but at least they were facing it together. Mike thought of his conversation with Kiki earlier that day and felt a spark of optimism. "Mama," he said softly, "I spoke with Kiki today. Her father, Mr. Akin, he's trying to help us. Maybe things will change soon." Mama Ada's grip on Mike's hand tightened. "Really?" she asked, a note of hope creeping into her voice. "Oh, I pray that's true." As night fell outside their small home, mother and son sat together, drawing strength from each other's presence. They didn't know what the future held, but they were determined to face it as a family, united in their love for each other and for Mr. James. In the Yoruba community, King Oba sat on his ornate wooden throne, his brow furrowed in deep thought. After a moment of contemplation, he called for his trusted advisor. "Come, my friend," King Oba said, as the advisor entered the room. "I need you to draft a letter to the king of the Igbo community. This message is of utmost importance." The advisor bowed respectfully and took a seat at a small writing desk. "I'm ready, Your Majesty. What would you like me to write?" King Oba cleared his throat and began to dictate. "My old friend, I hope this letter finds you well. I write to you with a heavy heart, seeking to mend the rift that has grown between our communities in recent weeks. First, I want to assure you that Mr. Akin has been duly punished for his transgressions. As recompense, he will provide a substantial supply of yams, vegetables, and corn to your community every month for the next year. I believe this punishment is fair and beneficial to both our peoples. I must also address the matter of Mr. James, who I understand is currently held in your dungeon. I humbly request that you consider releasing him. He has committed no grave offense, and I would be deeply grateful if you would show mercy in this matter. Furthermore, I believe it's time we reconsider the long-standing rules that have kept our communities apart. These restrictions have persisted for far too long, and I propose we work towards a future where our people can interact freely and peacefully. I extend an olive branch, hoping we can move forward not as adversaries, but as allies. Let us put aside our differences and build a relationship based on mutual respect and cooperation. I eagerly await your response and hope you will consider my proposal favorably. Your sincere friend, King Oba." As the advisor finished writing, King Oba nodded with satisfaction. "Read it back to me," he commanded. After listening to the letter, the king made a few minor adjustments before declaring it perfect. He then summoned a guard. "Take this letter to Mr. Akin immediately," King Oba instructed. "Tell him he must deliver it to King George when he goes to the Igbo community with his first food delivery. Make it clear that he is not to open or read the letter under any circumstances." The guard bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Majesty. I'll deliver it right away." As the guard hurried out of the palace, King Oba turned to his advisor. "What do you think? Will this help smooth things over?" The advisor nodded thoughtfully. "It's a wise move, Your Majesty. By offering both punishment and reconciliation, you show strength and compassion. I believe King George will respond favorably." King Oba sighed, a mixture of hope and concern on his face. "I pray you're right. The peace between our communities hangs in the balance. Let us hope this letter can begin to heal the wounds of the past and pave the way for a brighter future." In the grand palace of the Igbo community, King George sat upon his wooden throne, his face contorted with rage. Elder Sylvester stood by his side, a barely concealed smirk playing on his lips. The air in the throne room was thick with tension as King George's voice boomed out, calling for his guards. A guard rushed in, bowing low before the king. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling slightly. King George's eyes flashed with anger as he barked out his order. "Go to Mr. James's house immediately. Bring his wife, Mama Ada, to the village square. Do not delay." The guard nodded hastily. "Yes, Your Majesty." Right away he turned and sprinted out of the palace, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. No sooner had the first guard left than King George summoned another. This guard approached cautiously, sensing the king's foul mood. "You," King George pointed at the second guard, "go down to the dungeon and bring Mr. James to the village square as well. Now." "At once, Your Majesty," the guard replied, bowing deeply before hurrying away to carry out the king's command. Elder Sylvester's smile widened as he watched the scene unfold. He leaned in close to the king, his voice low and filled with satisfaction. "Finally, they will learn their lesson today. This will serve as a warning to all who dare defy our laws." King George nodded grimly, rising from his throne. "Indeed, my friend. It's time we reminded these villagers of the consequences of their actions." He turned to Elder Sylvester, his voice filled with determination. "Let's go. We shall witness this punishment ourselves." As they made their way out of the palace, King George called out to his personal guards, "Prepare my horse and gather a group of warriors. We ride to the village square." The palace courtyard erupted into a flurry of activity as guards and warriors scrambled to obey their king's commands. Horses were brought forth, their hooves clattering on the stone courtyard. As King George mounted his steed, he turned to Elder Sylvester. "This display of power will quell any thoughts of rebellion. Don't you agree, my trusted advisor?" Elder Sylvester nodded, his eyes glinting with malice. "Absolutely, Your Majesty. A public punishment is just what we need to maintain order." With a signal from the king, the procession began to move. King George and Elder Sylvester rode at the front, flanked by a contingent of fierce-looking warriors. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the streets as they made their way towards the village square. As they rode, villagers peeked out from behind curtains and doorways, their faces etched with fear and curiosity. Whispers spread rapidly through the community the king was on the move, and something big was about to happen. Mr. Akin stood outside his hut, preparing for his journey to the Igbo community. A cart piled high with tubers of yam, vegetables, and corn stood ready, with one of Mr. Akin's farm workers poised to push it. As they were about to set off, the sound of approaching footsteps caught Mr. Akin's attention. Looking up, he saw a royal guard hurrying towards him. The guard, slightly out of breath, handed Mr. Akin a sealed letter. "King Oba has ordered me to give you this," the guard explained. "You are to deliver it to the king of the Igbo community. And remember, you are not to open it under any circumstances." Mr. Akin nodded solemnly, taking the letter. "I understand. Thank you." As the guard departed, Mama Kiki, who had been listening from inside, emerged from the hut with Kiki close behind. "What was that about?" Mama Kiki asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Mr. Akin held up the letter. "King Oba sent this for me to give to King George. I'm not supposed to open it." Mama Kiki nodded approvingly. "Well, make sure you deliver it safely and in one piece. As Mr. Akin turned to leave, Kiki suddenly spoke up. "Papa, I want to come with you." Mr. Akin immediately shook his head. "No, Kiki, we can't risk adding more problems to our situation." But Kiki persisted, her eyes pleading. "But Papa, I want to meet the king and tell him how sorry we are. I want to help make peace. After all, we're already serving the punishment." Mama Kiki considered for a moment before adding, "Well, it's not a bad idea. Perhaps Kiki's presence could soften the king's heart." Mr. Akin hesitated, weighing the risks and benefits. Finally, he relented. "All right, Kiki, but you must promise to behave yourself. Don't speak to anyone unless spoken to, understand?" Kiki nodded eagerly. "I promise, Papa. I'll be on my best behavior." As they prepared to leave, Mama Kiki watched them with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Be safe," she called out, "and may your efforts bring peace between our communities." The small group set off, with Mr. Akin and Kiki walking alongside the worker pushing the heavily laden cart. As they made their way along the path to the Egbo community, Kiki's curiosity got the better of her. "Papa," she asked, glancing at the letter in her father's hand, "what do you think is in the letter?" Mr. Akin looked down at his daughter, a small smile on his face. "I don't know, my dear, but I hope it contains words that can settle our differences and help us coexist together in peace." Kiki nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so too, Papa. Do you think King George will listen?" Mr. Akin sighed, his face growing serious. "I can't say for certain, Kiki, but we must have faith. Sometimes, small gestures can lead to big changes." As they continued their journey, the weight of their mission hung heavy in the air. The cart creaked and groaned under its load, a physical reminder of the debt they were paying. Yet with each step, there was also a glimmer of hope that this offering of food and the mysterious letter might be the key to mending the rift between their communities. "Papa," Kiki said after a while, her voice filled with determination, "when we meet King George, I want to tell him about Mike. I want him to understand that friendship can exist between our people." Mr. Akin looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "That's a noble thought, Kiki. But remember, we must be cautious. Let's see how the king receives us first." As the sun climbed higher in the sky over the Igbo community, tension was building. A royal guard, sent by King George, approached the modest home of Mama Ada and Mike. His fist pounded on the wooden door, the sound echoing ominously. Mama Ada opened the door, her eyes widening with shock and fear. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is my husband all right?" The guard's face remained impassive. "I have no business answering your questions," he replied coldly. "King George has summoned you and Mike to the village square immediately. If you refuse to come willingly, I have orders to take you by force." From inside the house, Mike overheard the guard's harsh words. He rushed out, his unseeing eyes filled with concern. "Mama, what's happening this time?" he asked, his voice laced with worry. Mama Ada turned to her son, trying to keep her voice steady. "King George has summoned us to the village square. We must go immediately." The guard's patience was wearing thin. "Hey, we don't have all day," he barked. "Are you coming willingly, or do I have to force you?" No, of course we'll go with you," Mama Ada quickly assured him, not wanting to escalate the situation. As they began their journey to the village square, Mama Ada's mind raced with possibilities. Was this about her confrontation with Elder Sylvester, or did it have something to do with her husband? The uncertainty gnawed at her, each step feeling heavier than the last. Mike sensed his mother's distress. "Mama," he whispered, "whatever happens, we'll face it together. Stay strong." Mama Ada squeezed her son's hand in response, drawing comfort from his unwavering support. As they neared the village square, a familiar figure came into view. Elder Chidi, his face etched with concern, approached the group. "What's going on here?" Elder Chidi called out, his eyes darting between Mama Ada, Mike, and the guard. "Where are you taking them?" Mama Ada stepped forward, her voice quavering slightly. "King George has summoned us to the village square. We don't know why." Elder Chidi's brow furrowed with worry. "I was on my way to your house, but since you've been summoned, I'll accompany you. You shouldn't face this alone." The guard, clearly irritated by the delay, snapped, "I don't have time for family reunions. Move it." As they continued their march to the village square, Elder Chidi fell in step beside Mama Ada and Mike. He spoke in a low voice, trying to offer some comfort. "Don't worry. I'll do everything in my power to help you. Whatever this is about, we'll face it together." Mama Ada nodded gratefully, but fear still gripped her heart. The village square was a hive of activity, centered around the large mango tree that stood at its heart. King George sat atop a makeshift wooden throne, his face stern and unyielding. Beside him, Elder Sylvester perched on a simple wooden chair, a look of smug satisfaction playing across his features. Tied to the mango tree, his face a mask of pain and confusion, was Mr. James. His eyes darted around the crowd, searching desperately for familiar faces, hoping to catch a glimpse of his wife and son. The villagers formed a tight circle around the scene, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Hushed whispers rippled through the crowd as they speculated about what was to come. "What do you think Mr. James did?" one villager whispered to another. "I don't know, but it must be serious for the king to make such a spectacle," came the hushed reply. King George's voice cut through the murmurs. "Silence," he commanded, and the square fell quiet. Turning to Elder Sylvester, he spoke in a low voice. "Are the guards not back with the wife and son yet?" Elder Sylvester shook his head. "Not yet, Your Majesty, but they should be here soon." Mr. James, gathering his courage, called out, "Your Majesty, please, what is the meaning of this?" King George's eyes flashed with anger. "Silence, prisoner. You'll speak when spoken to." The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone waited for whatever was to happen next. King George drummed his fingers impatiently on the arm of his throne, while Elder Sylvester's eyes gleamed with anticipation. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, with the fate of the James family hanging in the balance. As the minutes ticked by, the villagers held their breath, knowing they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. As Mr. Kiki and the farm worker entered the Igbio community, they were immediately struck by the unusual commotion. Villagers rushed back and forth, their faces etched with urgency and concern. The typically peaceful village had transformed into a scene of chaos and confusion. Kiki tugged at her father's sleeve, her eyes wide with worry. "Papa, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it always like this here?" Mr. Akin shook his head, his brow furrowed with concern. "No, Kiki, this is not normal. Something must be wrong." Determined to uncover the cause of the commotion, Mr. Akin stepped forward, trying to catch the attention of a passing villager. After a few attempts, a man finally stopped, his breath coming in short gasps. "Excuse me," Mr. N said politely. "Could you tell us what's happening?" The villager, clearly in a hurry, pointed towards the village square. "An execution," he panted. "The king and elders are there. It's about to happen." Without waiting for a response, the man turned and dashed away, leaving Mr. Akin stunned. Mr. Akin returned to Kiki, his face pale. "Kiki," he said softly, "the man says there's going to be an execution in the village square. The king and elders are there." Kiki's eyes widened in horror. "Papa," she gasped, "what if it's Mr. James? We have to go to the village square right away." Mr. Akin's jaw dropped in shock. "Do you really think it could be Mr. James?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kiki nodded vigorously. "I don't know for sure, but the king is there. We have to go and see. We might be able to help." Mr. Akin hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks. Finally, he nodded. "You're right, Kiki. We can't stand by if Mr. James is in danger, but we must be careful." Turning to the farm worker, Mr. Akin gave quick instructions. "Let's go." As they made their way towards the village square, the crowd grew thicker, and the air buzzed with tension. Kiki clung tightly to her father's hand, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. "Papa," she whispered, "what if we're too late?" Mr. Akin squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We mustn't think like that, Kiki. We have the letter from King Oba. Perhaps it can help." As the guard escorted Mama Ada, Mike, and Elder Chidi into the village square, a hush fell over the crowd. King George rose from his makeshift throne, his eyes blazing with anger. "Finally, she's here," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the square. "The people we have all been waiting for." The villagers and other elders exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. King George continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "This woman had the audacity to insult an elder. She spat on him, and if that wasn't enough, she dared to accuse me, your king, of killing my own wife and children. How dare you?" He roared, pointing an accusing finger at Mama Ada. The crowd gasped, shocked by the severity of the accusations. "For these transgressions," King George declared, "you and your husband will each receive 25 lashes and be banished from the Agjibo community." Elder Sylvester, standing beside the king, shouted, "Quiet. Listen to your king." Mama Ada, Mike, and Elder Chidi stood frozen in shock, their mouths agape. After a moment, Mama Ada stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "My lord, I'm confused," she pleaded. "I didn't spit on Elder Sylvester, nor did I say such things about you. I swear by the gods of our land I never spoke ill of you or your family." Tears streamed down her face as she continued. "Yes, I was angry and said some disrespectful things to Elder Sylvester, but I never mentioned you or your family, my lord." King George's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting that Elder Sylvester, my trusted friend, is lying?" Before Mama Ada could respond, Elder Sylvester interjected, his face contorted with rage. "How dare you lie to our faces, you good-for-nothing woman? Guards, seize her at once and carry out her punishment." As the guards moved to grab Mama Ada, Mike's face filled with anger. He tried to lunge forward, but Elder Chidi held him back. "No, my son," Elder Chidi whispered urgently. "Now isn't the time." From where he was tied to the mango tree, Mr. James began shouting furiously. "Leave my wife alone," his cries echoed across the square, but were ignored by the king and his men. The guards roughly tied Mama Ada to another tree, preparing to administer her punishment. The crowd watched in horrified silence, torn between their respect for the king and their disbelief at the unfolding events. Just as the first guard raised the cane, a loud shout pierced the air from the edge of the square. "King George!" "King George!" The voice grew louder as it approached. Every head in the square turned towards the commotion. To everyone's surprise, it was Mr. Akin, running towards them with Kiki close behind. Mr. Akin pushed through the crowd, panting heavily. "Your Majesty, please wait," he called out, waving a sealed letter in his hand. King George's face twisted with annoyance. What is the meaning of this interruption? Mr. Akin fell to his knees before the king, holding out the letter. "Your Majesty, I bring an urgent message from King Oba of the Yoruba community." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elder Sylvester's face paled slightly, but he quickly composed himself. "This is not the time for messages from other kingdoms," Elder Sylvester snapped. "We are in the middle of administering justice." But King George, his curiosity piqued, held up a hand to silence his advisor. "Let him speak," he commanded, his eyes fixed on the sealed letter. The village square buzzed with tension as Mr. Akin approached King George, bowing respectfully. Kiki, trailing behind her father, caught sight of Mike and flashed him a warm smile, which he returned despite the gravity of the situation. "My lord," Mr. Akin began, his voice steady, "I'm Mr. Akin from the Yoruba community. King Oba sent me here with an urgent message." King George's brow furrowed in confusion. "So, you're the man who visited my community without seeking formal permission," he stated, his tone sharp. Mr. Akin remained silent, instead reaching into his pocket to produce the sealed letter. King George accepted it, breaking the seal and reading its contents carefully. His eyes darted back and forth, taking in every word. After finishing, King George's gaze fell upon the cart laden with farm produce. "I must say, it's a generous offer," he mused, "but we don't lack food here." Mr. Akin pressed on, his voice earnest. "I understand, my lord, but please, accept our gesture and let's settle this matter once and for all." King George shook his head, his resolve seemingly unshaken. "Never," he declared, turning to the guard with the cane. "Carry on. Flog her and her pathetic husband." As the guard raised the cane, a shout erupted from the crowd. A woman pushed her way forward, her face set with determination. "My lord, I have something to say." King George thought to himself, "What nonsense is this?" King George's eyes narrowed. "Well, speak up," he demanded. The woman took a deep breath before continuing. "I witnessed what truly happened. Mama Ada did not spit on Elder Sylvester, nor did she say anything about your family. Elder Sylvester is lying, my lord. I can swear with the gods of our land, my king." Elder Sylvester's face contorted with rage. "How dare you call me a liar, woman," he sputtered. "Are you stupid? Do you want to end up like them?" King George raised a hand for silence, his eyes now fixed on Elder Sylvester. King George thought to himself that a villager cannot lie to him, to his face, even risk the punishment that is to come if he finds out she is lying, however this has to be true. Just then he thought to himself to play along and test Elder Sylvester and believe the woman to see his reaction. "So, you lied to me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You lying snake. You cooked up all these stories? For what?" Elder Sylvester fell to his knees, panic etched across his face. "I'm sorry, my king." It was the devil, he cried out. King George's mouth wide open in shock. "So it's true." "Shut your mouth," King George roared. "You played me, you fooled me. You will regret your actions, I promise you that. Guards, seize this ungrateful man and tie him to the mango tree. Flog him 25 lashes, so he can feel what he make people pass through." As the guards dragged Elder Sylvester to the tree, King George turned to the guard with the cane. "Free them," he commanded. "Free the husband as well. Let them go. I have been deceived by someone so close to my heart." Relief washed over the crowd as Mama Ada and Mr. James were released. King George then addressed Mr. Akin. "I accept your king's proposal," he said, a hint of weariness in his voice. Mr. Akin's face lit up with joy, but he hesitated for a moment. "One more thing, my lord," he ventured. "What is it?" King George asked, raising an eyebrow. "My daughter," Mr. Akin explained, gesturing towards Kiki. "She is in love with Mike. It would bring us great joy if they could be together without fear." To everyone's surprise, a smile spread across King George's face. "You have my blessing," he declared. The king then turned to the guard with the cane. "Go on," he said, "flog him 25 lashes." As the guard raised the cane, he landed it on Elder Sylvester's back. and he shouted, "Jesus!" his eyes and mouth wide open. Everybody, including the king, started laughing. King George then turned and left the village square. The village square erupted in cheers and celebration. Kiki rushed to Mike, enveloping him in a tight embrace. Mama Ada ran to her husband, tears of joy streaming down her face as they held each other close. Elder Chidi approached Mr. Akin, extending his hand in friendship. As they shook hands, both men knew that this moment marked the end of the conflict between their communities and the beginning of a new era of peace and understanding. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village square, the air was filled with laughter and joy. Families reunited, new friendships formed, and the seeds of love between Kiki and Mike were given room to grow. The day that had started with fear and tension had transformed into a celebration of unity and forgiveness, promising a brighter future for both the Agbo and Yoruba communities.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. Kindly click the subscribe button, like, comment, and share this video. Watch out for more intriguing and eye-catching videos from your favorite YouTube channel.